and were giving remains to family members in a plastic bag. So if we look at some of the crimes confessed by some 5 major paramilitary commanders, not necessarily the worst criminals, but 5 of them, including Salvatore Mancuso, who was the chief of the paramilitaries when they demobilized. So he has confessed 3,000, over 3,000, almost 4,000 crimes that produced more than 15,000 victims. So he is now in a federal prison in the US, accused of drug trafficking. When the paramilitaries were in the process of demobilizing, in one of the most obscure moments of that demobilization process, President Uribe decided to extradite several of them, around 10 if I remember correctly, to the United States. Still today, no one is sure why they were extradited. Some people speculated at the moment that it was because the President Uribe was not interested that those paramilitaries confess, but some of them have been able to continue with their confessions from the U.S. through special agreements between with the Attorney General Office. Another paramilitary, Hernan Giraldo, known as El Patron, he's also in a federal prison here in the U.S. Ivan Roberto Duque, he's in a prison in Colombia. Freddy Rendon, El Alemán, he was set free after 8 years of a prison sentence in Colombia, and the same with Ramon Isaza, one of the oldest paramilitary leaders in the country. So, in this effort to bring truth to the victims, the Center of Historical Memory, a state institution that was created over the last several years, there have been signed agreements with low-ranking ex-paramilitaries so that they can also confess, not through the judiciary, but with the idea of keeping the historical memory. So far, 5,800 paramilitaries has felt their truth. And so it's a huge amount of information for future researchers interested in Colombia, interested in this type of topics, that Colombia is becoming a special place for that kind of studies. So let's focus quickly now. I'm extending more than I anticipated. The peace process with the FARC-EP that started in 2012. This was the roadmap that was agreed on at the beginning of the talks on August 26, 2012. That 6 topics will be considered in the first column. Those are the different themes. And they have been working on those processes, not necessarily in order. So the first partial agreement was agreed on September 6, 2015 on the topic of political participation, followed by this topic on the solution of illegal drugs on May 16, 2015, and the latest one on December 15, 2015, on the victims agreement, that again is perhaps the most important agreement so far. That, as I said at the beginning, it showed us and it showed Colombia, this process, my work. There are still 2 topics pending, but on December 15, President Santos and the chief of FARC, Timochenko, agreed to set a deadline to end the conversations, and it will be March 23rd of this year, basically in 23 days. So I want to talk briefly about the Agrarian Reform Agreement. Have 5 main components: access to land for landless peasants and regularization of current tenure of land, the recognition and support of a figure that is in the agrarian law in Colombia, the peasants' reserve areas, and other forms of association based on solidarity principles, the closing of the agricultural frontier and the protection of areas of environmental interest, and development programs with a territorial approach and national plans for comprehensive rural reform. So nothing revolutionary really in those agreements, but very important. So I will skip that part to focus now on the victims agreement. So here, this picture was published in almost all the newspapers worldwide when that agreement was signed. It was the first time that President Santos on the left was meeting with Timochenko on the right in Cuba, and President Fidel Castro in the middle. So this is a kind of summary of that agreement. It's a very complex, extremely interesting document, 65 pages. A transitional justice approach, and basically it's had three main components. The first one is a commission for the clarification of truth, coexistence, and non-repetition. It's a non-judicial body, and the idea is the focus will be on the historical truth of the conflict, and the expected outcome is a final report with conclusions and recommendations. The time frame for that will be a 3-year period to deliver that. There is discussion how to set the members of that commission. There's still details that are pending. But the second main component is the creation of a special unit to search for persons that has been forcibly disappeared in the context of the armed conflict. It's again a non-judicial body created for humanitarian purposes, and the expected outcome is after searching, they should submit an official report to their relatives saying what happened to their family members. There is no time frame, but it's only mentioned that it will be transitory. And the other one, the big one, the most complex one, the special jurisdiction for peace, is a judicial mechanism, and the expected outcome of that would be trust, justice, reparation, and guarantees of no repetition, and the transitional justice framework. There is no time frame for that jurisdiction, and it is mentioned only that it will operate until it completes its duties. I think that I will stop here because we have more speakers. Thank you very much.
I want to present a few observations. We don't have a lot of time, and I'm going to be kind of brief in what I say. Observations that are essentially possible challenges to this really rather complicated system that you've seen, a system for essentially answering the question of victims, providing victims' rights, providing a place for victims to be heard, and for the truth of what happened to come out, and as they say, justice done through some sort of sentences. And the provision is also for reparations. I don't know to what degree families that have suffered losses are going to receive compensation, but that's one of the things that is also discussed and a point in this transitional justice system that Carlos has been describing. And then there's the guarantee of non-repetition. And again, I think there are some real questions there. Some of the things that Cecilia pointed out about the way that the Patriotic Union people were treated when they came back from warfare and entered into civilian life and ran for public office, and 5,000 of those Patriotic Union people were murdered or had to leave the country. So there are real questions, and given the past in Colombia, there are questions about how this agreement is going to work out as far as peace in Colombia is concerned. There are certain focuses of difficulties that may be presented by this transitional justice system. First of all, we should mention that there's a substantial part of the Colombian political system and the electorate that's opposed to this. Former President Alvaro Uribe has said that he's absolutely opposed to the terms of this peace agreement, and what he'd like to see essentially is war, military action, and to eliminate the guerrillas through military action. And I'd just like to say one thing about that. I think Cecilia mentioned it briefly. There really is a difficulty in seeing a future for guerrilla warfare, at least in a country like Colombia. The United States has supplied electronic and other items, equipment, that now makes it possible for the Colombian government to locate a specific person. Let's say Raul Reyes, who was the second in command of the FARC, and he was essentially eliminated through the use of a smart bomb. The coordinates and all were worked out with the United States military, and then the Colombian military used that to eliminate the second-ranking member of the FARC guerrillas at that time. I think it essentially means that anybody and anywhere in the country can be located, and as Cecilia said, it doesn't matter if it's in the jungle with forest cover or whatever. People can be located, and I really think that means that guerrilla warfare of the FARC or the ELN guerrillas, which is another guerrilla group in Colombia, I think that their future is really limited by that. And I think they know it, and I think that's why when the negotiations were underway, one of the leaders of the FARC was killed by the Colombian army, and the talks went on, even in spite of the fact that one of their important leaders was killed by the government, by the military. But popular opposition to this by former President Alvaro Uribe and people in his party is a serious question, because at the last presidential election, President Santos, who ran on a peace platform, won by something like 52 or 53% of the vote, and the opposition, who was against these peace agreements, got about 47 or 48% of the popular vote. So it's a very substantial number of people who are not convinced by this structure that peace will really turn out. There's another question, and that is, how is this going to be ratified? The FARC would like to have a constitutional convention, essentially, and probably revise the Constitution in a way that would allow them greater liberty and greater protections. The government wants to have a plebiscite, some sort of a popular vote to be taken to the people to vote. Then the question is, how many people would have to approve this in a vote in order to have it valid? Several years ago, President Uribe had a series of referendum items. There were, I think, 20-some, and he presented it for popular consideration for a vote. And all but one of those propositions lost. Didn't get the 25% that they needed. He said that 25% as the amount, the percentage that would have to be received in order for that provision to be enacted. And only one of those 20-some received 25%. So the government has to decide at this point. There's no clear decision about how this peace agreement is going to be ratified by the Colombian people. That's an issue. It's going to take some debate, I imagine, in the Colombian Congress to determine how that's going to work out. A second major point is that Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have both criticized this peace agreement, and the point that they criticize is that there are some very, very serious crimes involved here. Crimes, violation of war crimes, violations of international humanitarian law. And if you're going to put people in a scheme where you have, as we had a major paramilitary figure who was in 8 years, he was released, and without really clarifying much of what he did during his time as a paramilitary leader, that's a problem for them. They say that a more serious prosecution of these criminals, these people for their crimes, needs to take place. There is also a question about the the special treatment given to the military officers, because the government has said, well, this agreement, we're going to build in some special protections for military leaders. There's a question whether a general or a colonel in charge of troops that commit war crimes or other offenses against where there are victims, to what degree is the commanding officer responsible? Is he responsible if he knew that the troops were out there and that there was a popular meeting that they were going to be involved in suppressing? If not, to what degree is the command responsible for what the lower level troops do? And that's a question that's unresolved. It will have to be resolved in some way through the implementation of this agreement. There's also a question about the responsibility of private sector supporters. Carlos mentioned Chiquita Brands, which provided millions of dollars to paramilitaries so that they would not interfere with the operations of Chiquita Brands. They paid a certain amount per box of bananas that was shipped out of Colombia. And there's a question of how these are going to be treated. Drummond Coal Company is another company that's been responsible for lots of murders of people in the course of their running their operations, and they've hired paramilitaries to do that. Now, should they be held responsible? Well, it's not clear in this scheme how they're going to be held responsible. The important issue also of how the demobilized FARC troops are going to be able to enter political life. We have some examples. For instance, Ivan Marquez, who is the spokesperson for the FARC guerrillas in the negotiations that are taking place between the government and the FARC in Havana, Cuba. He was a member of the Patriotic Union Party, and he ran for office and was elected. But of course, when the killings began, then he rejoined the guerrillas in the countryside. Now the question is, what kind of guarantees are there going to be for somebody like Ivan Marquez, who of course is going to want to return to run as a candidate for public office? The government has made promises here, but there's nothing really to indicate that it's going to be able to carry out these promises. The government has talked about locating the former guerrillas of the FARC in different areas of the country where they would kind of be in semi-control. Not clear how that's going to work either. So these are major issues that are still pending in these negotiations. And there's a big question as to whether there will be sufficient guarantees so that we don't repeat what happened with the Patriotic Union. Another issue is, what about the paramilitaries? The government of Álvaro Uribe determined that there were no more paramilitaries. There were just what they called criminal gangs, BACRIM, they call them, bandas criminales. And the government of Santos said, oh yeah, there are no more paramilitaries. Well, in fact, some of the paramilitary organizations never demobilized, as a part of what Carlos showed. And there are others that have arisen since then. And there are paramilitaries in different areas of the country, including very close to our sister community here in Dane County of San Jose de Apartado, the peace community of San Jose de Apartado. What is going to happen with paramilitaries? What kind of guarantees will be given to the FARC guerrillas who return to private life and maybe want to engage in public activity? What kind of guarantees are they going to have that the paramilitaries are not going to be there to oppose them? That's a very serious issue. Cecilia pointed out, I think the last issue I'll bring up, because we don't have much time, is the issue about what the Colombian government is doing in its political policies and its economic and political determinations that will be effective, affecting what's done in this peace agreement. And as Cecilia pointed out, the government has passed, and it's passed in the national plan, the National Development Plan. It's passed a resolution where they create these units called ZDREs, which are large units in the countryside where supposedly they're going to be development of large-scale agriculture. This is an effort to really improve the production of agriculture, expand the production of agriculture, but it has a great likelihood of having the peasants who live in that area, the campesinos, lose their lands. And so you have, on the one hand, you have these peace discussions, and on the other hand, you have the government continuing its economic philosophy. President Santos said, this is not going to be affected by the peace agreements. We're going to continue to run the economy as we have, and the military is not going to be reduced. There's no peace dividend here as far as the reduction of military. Colombia is even providing military training for other countries to use those military officers, the Colombian military officers. So there's a whole development of things on this side which don't exactly match what you would want with the peace agreement.
Thank you, Jack. I chose to focus on the final part of the agreement where the governments both, I suppose, but this is going to be the task of the Colombian government, to guarantee that there will be no repetition of this conflict. Now, how in the world can that be done? It would mean that the Colombian government, guilty of all the things that our three speakers have just described, would do a 180, a completely different kind of a government, one that goes out into the countryside, that doesn't leave the countryside to be ruled by guerrillas or paramilitaries, which has been pretty much the same for the campesinos. And as you saw in the chart of victims, I think that rather than fighting each other, you know, the whole idea of the paramilitaries was to kill the guerrillas. Well, mostly they just both killed the campesinos. It was a war of the poor against the poor. I want to talk about more bad news, because there's good news and bad news. And they've already done a good job with the bad news. And I think I have a little bit more, but I want to focus on why the government has to do a 180, be a different government than it's ever been before, and how maybe that can be done and why it has to be done. On his trip to Washington to accept U.S. aid for Paz Colombia, President Santos said that the goal would be rural economic development, to bring the government to those areas where it has been absent, to arrive with schools, hospitals, and rural roads. But unfortunately, people who have been working in land restitution and other community organizing in the boondocks, you might say, are threatened all the time. And a good number of them have been killed. But I want to focus precisely on what the draft agreement says that Colombia will do, and then identify some of the problems. Maybe there is some hope. One hope, I would say, is that they seem to know what's wrong. Whether they can do anything about it, I'm not sure. Colombia's chief negotiator, Humberto de la Calle, recently identified the problem. At a forum at Rosario University, he said, something's going on in a society if a guerrilla force is able to hang on for 50 years. Something is going to have to happen in this society, and we can't deny that. And then subsequently, the other one, Sergio Jaramillo, the head of peace, said that, you know, in the past we haven't done a very good job of that. Probably wins the award for the understatement of the year, the decade. But I want to identify right in the agreement exactly what the government says it will do. There will be no more political violence, is number one. In last fall's municipal elections, 7 candidates were murdered. In 2011, there were 41 candidates murdered, so you could say there's progress. But today's El Colombiano says that the mayor of Apartado and 3 council members have received death threats. So that's not a very good start on there will be no more political violence. This is what the government is going to have to overcome. Peaceful demonstrations and protests must be protected is number 2. Unfortunately, it looks as if ESMAD, which is the crowd control police, have gotten meaner and have beaten up and arrested more protesters. So that doesn't seem to be going in the direction that the government has promised to go. Criminal organizations must be eliminated. Well, more on this. The government is committed to supporting human rights. There will be a national human rights education plan. And here's the big one. The government accepts its responsibility to govern. And this is going to require a historic change of the political system. Did you think that Colombia had a functioning government? Here's some current information. RCN Radio reports a study on mining carried out by Externado University. It reports that 60% of all mining in Colombia is illegal, and that 80 Colombian rivers are contaminated with mercury. Today's El Espectador, 6,000 children are without school lunches in Antioquia. And if you've been following the school lunch scandal, there are schools all over Colombia where corruption, skimming has taken away the money for the school lunches, and the kids aren't getting school lunches. Semana.com, February 20th. 1 year ago, the Constitutional Court imposed a detailed order for improvement of serious deficits in health services in Chocó. As of this date, almost all of the court's order has been ignored. Recent revelation that prison inmates have killed a good number of inmates, I think it's in the hundreds, and cut them into pieces. The papers haven't covered this scandal to the extent that I thought they might. I even saw something in a U.S. paper on this particular scandal, and you don't see much in U.S. papers about Colombia. So the absence of the central government has left hundreds of thousands of country people at the mercy of corrupt local officials, paramilitaries, and criminal gangs. I don't want to talk quite as much about the gangs, but just about the government. Mancuso put it in an interview. 35% of the Congress was elected in areas where there were states of the self-defense, that's the paramilitaries. In those states, we were the ones collecting taxes. We delivered justice. We had the military and territorial control of the region, and all the people who wanted to go into politics had to come and deal with the political representatives we had there. This is Mancuso. Today, in Noticias Uno, which is the progressive radio station, General Rito Alejo del Rio, our friend from the 17th Brigade in Carepa, according to Don Berna, who is one of the highest paramilitaries, that Rito Alejo was actually a member of the paramilitary's governing board. More on that. That'll be interesting. Here's another detail about paramilitary. Now, we're not talking about atrocities, although I'm sure they were there, just about the government. Paramilitary leader Martin Llanos, and this is in the Department of Casanare. He lists the following rules. If you wanted to be a mayor in his area, here's what you had to do. Give 50% of the municipality budget to be managed by the paramilitaries. Give 10% of each and every contract of the municipality to the paramilitaries. Mandatory attendance at all the meetings called by the paramilitaries. Inclusion of the paramilitary peasants of Casanare, those in every infrastructure project. And as we have already heard, when they were demobilized, the senior leaders are in prison, and their actual number on the ground has doubled in Urabá. Urabá is the area where we who visit with the sister community, the peace community of San Jose de Apartadón, they report regularly on the prevalence of the paramilitaries in their area, although the latest thing that the colonel in charge of the 17th Brigade said, well, there aren't any, but there might be a few, but they don't harm anybody, except we know they kill people. But I just want to have one more item. Did I have, oh yes, this paramilitary group put forth, it's a Jose Luis Zuliaga Front. it put forth its own statutes. It collected taxes. It regulated trade and social life. It had its own hymn, its own prayer, and a